They gathered to witness a warning they believed no longer mattered. The command dais of the Varkos Dominion glowed in pale gold, reflecting the confidence of officers who had never known defeat. 11 admirals stood around the projection table, their eyes fixed on the Terran border message looping for the fourth time, calm, concise, and delivered without a single threat. It simply stated, "Entry into Terran space without clearance will be met with automatic defensive response." The room erupted in laughter as the final line repeated, the words Terran jurisdiction triggering another wave of disbelief. "Primitive processing relics," Admiral Korvac scoffed, tapping the message away. "They still think their old machine grids frighten anyone." Another commander chimed in, claiming humans hadn't fielded a modern fleet in centuries. The only data they had on Terran forces was outdated by at least 200 years. In their minds, that alone proved superiority. The Empire had grown complacent yet bold, eager to expand past the last unclaimed frontier. Terran space was simply in the way. A lieutenant projected the map, 11 invasion vectors converging on a single border seam. Transit will take 9 minutes. Their nearest patrol post appears unmanned. Applause scattered across the table, as if the operation were already a parade. When someone asked if humans might retaliate, Korvac waved the question aside with a tired flick. If they had the will, they would have shown it generations ago. A stinger line dropped into the air like a blade. They expect silence from Earth. Approval of the border breach passed without hesitation. 11 signatures flashed across the holoslate, authorizing the ships to cross the line humans had defended for centuries. The admirals spoke as though humanity were an artifact rather than a rival, a species locked in static time, running obsolete processors and clinging to obsolete pride. The words relic and irrelevant circulated with ease, as if mocking Terrans were part of the Empire's military doctrine. Outside the command chamber, launch crews prepared the incursion fleet. 11 cruisers, polished in Empire colors, pulsed with readiness. They carried the latest atmospheric cutters, tri-core reactors, and a new generation of sensor disruptors. Engineers boasted that Terran systems wouldn't even detect them until they were already inside the border seam. The fleet commander promised a swift penetration, a demonstration of strength meant to push humanity into diplomatic submission. No one considered the possibility of resistance beyond token fire. No one asked whether Terran silence meant something else. Crew chatter echoed through the vessel halls. Jokes about human fragility and outdated machines passed freely. One officer claimed Terrans still used manual targeting, drawing more laughter. Another predicted the operation would become required viewing at the Dominion War Academy. In their minds, this was not a battle. It was an inspection of a wilderness left behind by time. A second stinger landed quietly, unheard by those who needed it most. Misjudgment begins with confidence. The 11 cruisers aligned into their breach formation, engines humming as the countdown neared zero. Dominion flags shimmered along their hulls, symbols of an empire convinced of its own inevitability. In the command chamber, Korvac watched the timer descend, hands clasped behind his back, expression serene. The Terran warning message hovered beside him, unacknowledged and unanswered. When the final second expired, the admirals offered a toast to easy victory. The fleet surged forward, crossing the Terran threshold with perfect formation discipline, certain the galaxy would applaud their boldness. They never imagined humanity had been listening the entire time. The message arrived in the Terran Diplomatic Corps at 0312 Standard, a quiet ping against a silent room. No alarms, no raised voices, only the soft illumination of a channel request from the Dominion fleet moving toward the border seam. 10 senior diplomats reviewed the packet together, reading the incursion vectors, scanning the arrogance woven through each line, and noting the precise moment the Empire approved its 11-ship breach. No one expressed shock. Terran analysts had predicted this pattern years ago. What mattered now was the reply. Ambassador Rhea Solon stood at the center of the chamber, her voice steady as she initiated global broadcast routing. One message, she instructed, calm, final, unmistakable. Her tone carried the weight of centuries, doctrine etched not from fear but from preparation. As the Dominion cruisers crossed the threshold, Rhea delivered humanity's last formal warning. Return to your side of the line. Cease all forward motion. Terran defensive systems are now active. This is your final notice. No anger, no ornament, just precision. The message traveled outwards on a narrow band beam, threading cleanly across the border seam. Dominion sensors caught it instantly, though their commanders dismissed the content as expected bluster. They noted the absence of threats and assumed it signaled weakness. They never considered that Terran strategy demanded calm clarity before any action, a principle etched into protocol since the early colonial wars. Behind the diplomats, status boards shifted from cool blue to disciplined amber. The Terran border grid, 4,000 satellites suspended across millions of kilometers, stirred from passive observation into coordinated readiness. One by one, nodes aligned their kinetic rails, tightened firing lattices, and linked into the kill web that had waited, silently, for moments exactly like this. Each satellite confirmed its lock with absolute precision. No drift, no hesitation, no margin for error. A stinger line settled like a cold verdict. Activation complete, 4,000 awake. Rhea watched the grid formation render across the holotable. Thin silver lines threaded between the satellites, mapping corridors the Dominion fleet would unknowingly enter within minutes. She did not celebrate the efficiency. Terran doctrine forbade anything resembling triumph before violence. Competence was duty, not ego. Instead, she reviewed the outgoing warning once more, ensuring every syllable adhered to policy. In the strategic wing below, officers monitored thermal signatures of the approaching cruisers. The ships maintained tight formation, unaware that each kilometer forward triggered deeper layers of Terran automation. Power relays brightened, shield harmonics shifted to combat frequency. Interceptor hangars received silent commands and began cycling pilots through readiness checks. No countdown was spoken aloud. The systems themselves tracked distance, velocity, and breach parameters with relentless calm. Another stinger dropped like a quiet drumbeat. Final warning issued. On the Dominion side, confusion briefly flickered when the Terran beam rebroadcast itself across emergency frequencies. To them, it felt ceremonial, an outdated human ritual marking territory they believed irrelevant. Their reply, if it could be called one, arrived as a burst of static-laced dismissal. No course correction, no acknowledgement, no pause in their advance. Rhea received the packet, read it once, and closed the channel. Then, the refusal is recorded, she said. Proceed with defensive posture. Orders transmitted through encrypted relays. Across the border, thousands of satellites snapped into absolute alignment, their geometry shifting with the precision of a single organism. The kill web settled into readiness, silent and patient, waiting for the moment the invaders would finally trigger what came next. The diplomats stood together in the dim glow, united not by anger, but certainty. The Empire had chosen its path. Terran restraint had been honored. Now the grid would speak. The first shot came without declaration or warning, an eruption of violet energy that tore across the border seam and lit the void like a false sunrise. Dominion commanders believed this opening barrage would shock Terran systems into fragmentation. Instead, the blast met a silence so complete it felt unnatural. For a heartbeat, the fleet believed the strike had cast through empty space. Then the readings arrived. The Terran grid had absorbed 92.3% of the barrage. Not deflected, not weakened, absorbed. Satellites across millions of kilometers pulsed with captured energy, dispersing heat into deep space sinks with disciplined ease. Only 7.7% slipped past the absorption web. And even that remainder bent harmlessly around human sensor arrays, redirected by routines older than the Dominion's current generation of warships. A stinger line cut through the Dominion's growing confusion. Fire consumed, grid unbroken. Admiral Korvek demanded a recalculation, insisting their weapons could not simply vanish into Terran machinery. Engineers scrambled through data, but every graph repeated the same truth. The humans had built a defensive system designed for overwhelming force. What the Dominion believed would cripple their enemy had instead revealed the grid's full, terrifying maturity. Terran operators watched the incoming firestorms with clinical calm. Energy blooms rippled across the satellites, translated instantly into load balance signals and redistribution arcs. Each node communicated with the next through micro-latency pulses, rail capacitors aligned in perfect synchrony. The grid did not merely endure the assault, it learned from it. On command screens within Terran control, new telemetry appeared, detailed thread-like readings of the Dominion cruiser's weapon signatures. The residual 7.7% had acted like a dye tracer, slipping across hulls and outlining sensor ports, heat exchangers, and shield modulation patterns. The invaders had unknowingly illuminated themselves. Rhea Solon received the diagnostic overlay with steady breath. Their sensors are exposed, she noted, voice almost quiet. Shift lattice patterns to observational priority. The order traveled instantly. Several hundred satellites rotated with fractional precision, adjusting lenses and harmonic filters to analyze every weakness now visible in the enemy formation. Another Stinger landed with quiet finality. They gave us their map. On the Dominion flagship, alarms multiplied. Weapon officers prepared a second barrage, this time unleashing tri-lance clusters designed to overwhelm any known shield. The blasts converged in tight spirals, burning white-hot as they pierced the void. But the Terran grid responded faster than human eyes could follow. Interception rails pivoted, absorption nodes widened, and the kill web swallowed the volleys with the same unshakable efficiency. 92.3%. Again. The Dominion's pride wavered. Their strongest weapons had failed twice, offering nothing but telemetry for the enemy to study. Even worse, their own sensors flickered as Terran reflections rebounded along the corridors of redirected fire. Data packets scrambled, targeting models destabilized. Their ships were hemorrhaging information while receiving almost nothing in return. Terran officers marked each anomaly without celebration. Competence was procedural, precision was expected. Any display of false triumph would betray doctrine. Instead, they traced every exposed sensor node and logged each vulnerability for potential containment operations. When the final wave of energy faded, the border seam returned to quiet black. Dominion commanders waited for retaliation, but none came. Terran guns remained cold. Retaliation without necessity violated their codes. What the Empire interpreted as hesitation was, in truth, disciplined restraint. The grid had spoken. Now humanity understood their enemies, their sensors, their weaknesses, everything needed for what must follow. And the invaders had learned nothing at all. The void held its breath as the Dominion fleet steadied itself after the failed barrages. Their commanders expected Terran retaliation to arrive as heavy artillery, perhaps a crude kinetic volley that could be intercepted or outrun. What they did not expect was silence long enough to feel like a verdict. Then, without fanfare or broadcast, the border web shifted. From 4,000 satellites, a single command propagated outward: initiate acceleration protocols. The first interceptor broke formation like a blade of light, then another, then dozens. Sleek Terran craft unfolded from shadowed cradles, their engines igniting in staggered pulses. Within 0.3 seconds, every Dominion screen lit up with impossible numbers. Terran acceleration curves did not rise, they spiked, straight to 21G, not briefly, sustained, controlled. A Stinger cut through the growing panic. Interpolation failed at 21G. Dominion predictive models, war-tested, mathematically validated, and used across 12 species, collapsed under the trajectories. The interceptors didn't follow arcs or spirals or known pursuit patterns. They carved straight-line vectors no living crew should have survived. But the Terran craft held steady, inertial dampeners locked into perfect counterforce harmony, as if the pilots had trained their entire lives for this single moment. On the flagship bridge, Korvek watched in stunned disbelief. Their models attempted recalculation. Each projection diverged from reality within milliseconds. Course lines jittered, probability fans collapsed. The Terran ships were rewriting the parameters of movement. "This isn't possible," one navigator whispered, voice thinning. "They're not flying, they're dictating the space." But the interceptors were not coming to kill. Not yet. They were coming to reshape the field. The first wave cut between Dominion cruisers with razor-thin margins, meters, then centimeters, forcing each ship to adjust course to avoid collision. Those corrections compounded instantly, rippling through the formation like fractures across glass. Tight battle lines, once perfectly aligned, shifted into uneven angles. Rear vessels overshot forward markers.
Midline ships drifted into blind zones. The Dominion formation began to break itself. Terran officers monitored the collapse with quiet efficiency. Every interceptor movement was deliberate, cutting off escape vectors, forcing overcorrection, pushing the fleet into narrower and narrower channels. Each maneuver folded the Dominion's options inward, reducing the once confident armada to a lattice of crowded, vulnerable positions. No interceptor fired a shot. Their trajectory alone performed the deconstruction. Another stinger struck with surgical calm. Formation integrity compromised. Desperation finally hit the Dominion crews. Orders clashed across channels, retreat vectors conflicted, evasion patterns overlapped, and ships began turning into each other's paths. Thruster blooms ignited in frantic bursts. A cruiser clipped another shielding, sending both into spirals. Officers shouted for stabilization. Engineers claimed the models no longer displayed valid futures. Meanwhile, Terran interceptors maintained their unbroken precision. They rode 21G thrust as if it were a natural state. No drift, no hesitation. Every pass carved deeper instability into the Dominion formation without casualties. Doctrine required restraint until lethal force became unavoidable. For now, control mattered more than destruction. When the final interceptor wave swept past the Dominion vanguard, the fleet's lines were no longer a military formation. They were fleeing fragments pretending to be order. Retreat paths stretched in chaotic arcs. Attempts to regroup failed before they began. Korvac felt the shift in his bones. The battle had already turned, and Terrans had yet to fire a weapon. The grid steadied. Interceptors held vector silence. The field now belonged to humanity. For a brief moment, the void stood still. Dominion cruisers
drifted in fractured arcs, their formation in tatters, predictive models unreadable. Terran interceptors held in disciplined silence, forming a cold perimeter around the intruders. No taunts, no threats, only the quiet certainty of a force that had already mapped every outcome. Then the grid shifted again, softly, decisively, and the next phase began. Across the border web, firing lattices engaged. Thousands of satellite rails aligned, drawing on the energy absorbed from the earlier barrages. Capacitors stabilized, grav braces locked. Every node received the same command across micro-latency channels. Acquire, cycle, fire. Terran targeting locks initiated their sequence. 0.4 seconds per cycle. Not theoretical, not burst limited, sustained. The first lock snapped into place, a clean silver thread binding a Dominion cruiser to a satellite node miles away. In the next 0.4 seconds, 20 more locks formed across the kill web. Dominion sensors detected the activity too late to interpret it. Their targeting screens flickered, then flooded with error flags as Terran rails resolved every ship's vector, hull contour, engine signature, and shield rotation. A stinger hit with the weight of inevitability. Lock confirmed, 0.4 seconds. The first rail spike fired. A tungsten lance, accelerated by electromagnetic coils, bridged thousands of kilometers in a breath. It cut through a Dominion engine cluster without explosion, only a silent collapse of structure as the spike carried its kinetic verdict through armor, conduits, and reactor housings. Internal alarms screamed across the cruiser, but no one understood the strike until half the ship dimmed. Then the second spike launched, and the third, and the fourth. Every 0.4 seconds, the grid inhaled, recalculated, and exhaled another perfect strike. No overkill, no wasted motion. Each shot targeted an exposed sensor, a stabilizer fin, a shield node, or a propulsion array identified earlier through redirected fire. Terran doctrine forbade unnecessary destruction. The objective was containment, not annihilation. Thus, the strikes were surgical: disable, disarm, dismantle. Dominion captains tried to issue countermaneuvers, but the orders arrived seconds too late. By the time a ship adjusted course, the Terran lock had already cycled. Each new vector only exposed fresh vulnerabilities, and the grid saw everything. A second stinger whispered through the collapsing formation. Trajectory rewritten, target neutralized. Cruiser after cruiser faltered. One lost all forward thrust. Another's primary sensors shattered, leaving the crew blind. A third spun helplessly as a spike sheared through its rotational stabilizers. Even the flagship's hardened plating could not escape the precision. Terran rails found the one point where armor contour dipped by a fraction of a millimeter, disabling its shields without breaching the hull. Inside Terran command, officers tracked each spike's outcome in calm succession. No cheers, no triumph, only confirmation tones marking progress through the containment matrix. Each strike tightened the cage forming around the 11 ships, pushing them towards surrender rather than destruction. Humanity had the upper hand, but doctrine demanded proportionality. Precision was the path to restraint. When the final rail cycle dimmed and targeting locks eased to standby, the Dominion formation no longer resembled a fleet. It was a scattered collection of wounded vessels drifting without cohesion, engines failing, sensors cracked, weapons silenced. Not one ship had been destroyed, yet all had been disarmed. The storm had lasted seconds. The message would last centuries. Silence followed the containment of the Dominion fleet, a silence not of victory but of calculation. Terran command allowed the disabled cruisers to drift into stable, non-threatening vectors, while interceptors held their perimeter with unwavering discipline. The grid remained active, yet restrained, its rails cooling from the quantified precision of the 0.4-second storm. No kill order had been given, no vessel had been destroyed. The battle had paused because humanity chose for it to pause. Ambassador Rhea Solon stepped into the strategic chamber as fresh telemetry scrolled across the hollow floor. 3 holographic orbs rotated slowly in a triangular pattern, each marked in stark red. Former systems, former colonies, now nothing but quiet. She addressed the room with a calm that carried through every console and corridor. "We proceed to the moral disclosure phase," she said. "Prepare the evidence package." A single stinger settled like a cold echo. 3 systems erased. The transmission opened across all Dominion channels, forced connection but not hostile. Terran diplomats refused intimidation, choosing clarity instead. Rhea's image appeared before the 11 damaged cruisers, her posture steady against the void. "Your incursion is not a matter of territory," she began. "It is a matter of survival. 3 frontier systems, Calyx 4, Meridian Reach, and Loom Sector, have vanished in the last 6 days. Not conquered, not evacuated, erased." Dominion captains stiffened. Their sensors had recorded unusual dust clouds along the border weeks earlier, but analysts dismissed them as Terran manipulations. Now Terran projections displayed the truth with clinical precision. Before and after star maps, gravitational data, and threading anomalies that reveal collapsing matter signatures where thriving systems had once been. Billions of life science gone without trace. Not enslaved, not displaced, removed. Their arrogance cracked. Another stinger drove the point deeper. "This is not a war of choice." Rhea continued, her voice utterly calm. "Your breach, your mocking dismissal of our warnings, forced an engagement neither of us needed. But the threat that consumed 3 of our frontier systems is indifferent to species, borders, or empires. We demand transparency regarding your deep space scans, sensor anomalies, and long-range disappearance reports. Your empire is hiding data, and that secrecy endangers us all." Korvek, battered by the weight of evidence, attempted deflection. His damaged flagship sputtered with half-dead sensors, the glow of railspike precision still etched across the hull. "Terran fabrication," he muttered, but the claim rang hollow even to his officers. The Dominion's own long-range archives showed similar anomalies near their outer sectors, data buried in bureaucracy, dismissed as sensor drift. Terran diplomats exposed those inconsistencies too. The grid's reflective readings from the redirected 7.7% energy remnant highlighted starfield distortions far beyond the battle site, patterns matching the vanishings exactly. Humanity had not merely prepared for war, it had prepared to understand what the galaxy refused to confront. Rhea's final words carried neither threat nor anger, only truth. "This conflict ends now. Not because you are defeated, but because the enemy neither of us understands has already crossed into our shared sky. We will not waste lives proving dominance while systems disappear around us. In the silence that followed, Dominion officers looked upon the Terran formation, not as primitive relics, but as the only force that had taken the vanishing seriously. Interceptors held position, rails dormant, satellites dimmed to amber readiness. No conquest, no cruelty, only a demand for truth. The moral frame had shifted, and the galaxy would have to shift with it. The diplomatic channel closed, leaving the void in a suspended quiet that carried more weight than any weapon strike. Dominion crews floated in the half-light of failing systems, their ships scarred, but intact, their pride fractured yet not erased. They waited for retaliation that never came. Instead, the Terran grid dimmed to a cool operational amber, signaling not escalation, but revelation. Humanity had shown what it could do, now it will show what it had. Ambassador Rhea Solon stepped back into command as a new holo array unfolded across the chamber. 18 points of light shimmered far beyond the border seam, nearly invisible in the darkness, but each pulsing with the unmistakable signature of Terran design. "Begin disclosure of deep space assets," she ordered. "They need to understand we did not stumble into readiness, we built it." A stinger settled like the quiet turn of a blade. 18 buoys awake. The projection widened, revealing the 18 deep space listening buoys stationed across a lattice millions of kilometers beyond Terran territory. They had remained silent for centuries, monitoring gravitational drift, cosmic dust densities, and anomaly signatures. Their data now aligned perfectly with the disappearances of Calyx 4, Meridian Reach, and Loom Sector. Not random, not natural, patterned, intentional. The Dominion officers absorbed the revelation with a mixture of awe and dread. Their own empire had nothing comparable. Humanity, dismissed for generations as stagnant, had been running deep space surveillance far beyond any frontier nation. Every buoy carried hardened sensors, null-frequency receivers, and silent propulsion anchors that allowed repositioning without detectable emissions. They had been watching the galaxy long before the galaxy bothered to watch them. Then the second revelation appeared. 67 Terran vessels illuminated in formation, suspended just behind the kill web. Their hulls, obsidian, angular, perfectly aligned, glowed beneath synchronized running lights. Not a chaotic scramble of reinforcements, not a desperate reaction. A deployment drilled so deeply into Terran doctrine that every crew moved as if they had rehearsed for this moment across generations. A second stinger followed, steady and unshaken. 67 ready. These were not the interceptors or satellites that had already reshaped the battlefield. These were line vessels, Dread-class, Lance carriers, and fast-response cruisers held in reserve until the moral and tactical thresholds aligned. Their arrival now was not for destruction, but containment of a threat the Dominion had refused to acknowledge. Rhea spoke into the open channel, her tone firm but never cruel. "We mobilized 67 vessels because your incursion was not isolated. It was a predictable consequence of what your empire has been ignoring. The disappearances, the drift patterns, the void signatures. We did not prepare for you. We prepared for this." Dominion captains exchanged uneasy glances. Their earlier mockery, primitive relics, outdated systems, irrelevant humans, felt unbearably small in the face of evidence. Terrans had built doctrine on time rather than pride. Centuries of isolation, discipline, and engineering refinement had produced a force shaped not by conquest, but by inevitability. Humanity had been preparing alone, and now the galaxy could finally see it. The Terran grid remained calm, no hostile locks engaged. Interceptors held their vectors with unmoving precision. The 67 vessels waited behind them like a wall of silent intention. This was not escalation. This was disclosure. And it marked the moment the Dominion realized the battle was never about superiority. It was about understanding the enemy humanity had spent centuries preparing to face, alone if necessary. The Dominion fleet drifted in wounded disarray, its ships dimmed by precision strikes, its pride hollowed by revelation. Yet not one vessel had been destroyed. Not one crew had been targeted beyond necessity. Terran doctrine demanded something more exacting than victory, containment without cruelty. And now, with the evidence delivered and the intentions made clear, the grid prepared for its final maneuver. Across millions of kilometers, satellite rails shifted into a new geometry. Thousands of nodes rotated in synchronized arcs, aligning their vector channels until thin silver corridors formed around the damaged cruisers. These weren't attack lines, they were boundaries, kinetic lanes engineered to restrict movement with impeccable accuracy. The Dominion fleet, once confident, now floated inside a cage built from math and restraint. A stinger settled like a quiet verdict. Corridors sealed. From behind the web, the 67 Terran vessels advanced in flawless formation. Obsidian hulls reflected the faint glow of satellite light, each ship maintaining an exact vector separation down to the meter. They did not accelerate aggressively. They did not posture. They simply moved forward with the calm certainty of a force that had no need to prove anything. Dominion captains scrambled through their failing systems. Attempts to maneuver out of the corridors triggered immediate counter-adjustments, not attacks, but pulses of kinetic pressure nudging them back into place. Each satellite rail emitted calibrated bursts, gentle enough to avoid damage, yet strong enough to deny escape. The grid was not a weapon now, it was a shepherd. Terran Command monitored the containment lines with unbroken focus. Officers measured every thruster flare, shield fluctuation, every drift vector from the 11 intruder ships. Where a cruiser tilted toward instability, Terran rails corrected the motion with a brief kinetic tap. Where a pilot tried to break formation, the corridor hardened, leaving no path forward except surrender. Another stinger fell with icy precision. Force minimal. Control absolute. A Dominion navigator gasped as his ship's attempted retreat was redirected with surgical finesse, spun gently into a holding position like a leaf caught in a structured current. Never before had they witnessed warfare without malice, only inevitability. The Terrans did not shout orders across the void. They did not demand kneeling or humiliation. Their restraint was more terrifying than conquest. The 67 Terran vessels settled into a multi-layer formation around the corridors, their weapons cold but fully calibrated. Each ship represented centuries of doctrine, not built to overwhelm but to contain. Their captains waited in silence, engines steady, hulls gleaming with the weight of unspoken authority. Inside the Dominion flagship, Corvick finally understood the true scale of his misjudgment. His fleet wasn't being destroyed, it was being managed. Every move had been anticipated, shaped, and neutralized with the precision of a force that viewed combat not as chaos, but choreography. "Why don't they finish us?" one officer whispered. Corvick had no answer, but the truth settled over him with a gravity he could no longer deny. Terrans weren't withholding fire because they were weak. They were withholding fire because they were strong enough not to need it. Terran interceptors held their perimeter. The grid hummed with stable containment frequencies. The 67 vessels waited, engines low, formation steady. No further escalation came. No threat. No ultimatum. Humanity had chosen the path of discipline, and the 11 intruding ships, trapped inside corridors of deliberate mercy, could only wait for what came next. The containment corridors softened their kinetic pressure as Terran vessels eased into final stabilization patterns. The battle was over in every measurable sense, yet no wreckage drifted, no bodies scattered through the void. 11 Dominion ships remained intact, disabled, disarmed, and held within boundaries shaped not by vengeance but by intent. Terran doctrine had delivered dominance without destruction. Now it would deliver something rarer: mercy. Medical corvettes emerged from the rear of the Terran formation, their hull markings glowing in calm white. They moved past Dread-class silhouettes with steady purpose, entering the corridors with diplomatic clearance codes that signaled a shift from combat protocol to humanitarian response. Dominion crews watched them approach with disbelief. They had expected boarding parties or execution squads.
Instead, the first transmission they received was simple: "Prepare your wounded. We will assist." A stinger settled with quiet weight. Mercy is policy. Terran med teams boarded in controlled waves, unarmed, carrying portable triage arrays and atmospheric stabilizers. They stepped through scarred corridors and collapsed engineering bays with professionalism untouched by bitterness. Dominion soldiers who had once mocked humanity now accepted water packs, oxygen stabilizers, and medical scans from Terran personnel who treated them with the same care given to their own. Inside the flagship, Korvek lay on the stretcher receiving reconstruction treatments for internal pressure shock. He stared up at the Terran medic calibrating the device. "You could have ended us," he murmured. "We don't end those who can stand trial," the medic replied, voice neither warm nor cruel, simply true. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels reopened. Ambassador Rhea Salin appeared before the Dominion Coalition Council via secure relay. Behind her, holo projections displayed the evidence of the 3 vanished systems, the grid telemetry, and the logs documenting every non-lethal strike. She spoke with measured clarity. "We offer medical aid freely, but the political consequences of your incursion will be addressed through law, not retaliation." Dominion representatives, shaken by the collapse of their incursion and the revelation of a greater threat, agreed to tribunal proceedings. Their fleet stood down across 2 sectors. What had begun as a show of force unraveled into a moment of reckoning. Another stinger drew the line between past and future. Justice replaces pride. Terran jurists outlined charges: unauthorized entry, assault on a sovereign border, negligence in hiding anomaly data that could have prevented 3-system erasure. But they also offered terms: cooperation in investigating the disappearances, joint transparency protocols, and access to Terran anomaly readings. Dominion leaders, confronted with irrefutable evidence of their own failures, accepted the framework. The room of delegates, once prepared to celebrate conquest, now listened to a species they had dismissed as relics. Terran vessels shifted into escort positions, guiding the 11 disabled cruisers toward a designated tribunal orbit. As they traveled, Dominion officers looked out their viewports at the silent formations of Terran ships. 67 vessels that had chosen restraint over spectacle. Not one weapon glowed, not one engine flared aggressively. Humanity had dominated the battlefield without cruelty. Now it shaped the politics of the galaxy with the same calm force. Trials would follow. Alliances would shift. Empires would rethink borders and arrogance. And through it all, Terran moral clarity would stand as the new axis of order. The battle had ended, but the consequences had only begun. The tribunal orbit settled into orderly silence as the last of the disabled Dominion cruisers anchored into position. Terran escort vessels held steady on the perimeter, engines dim, weapons cold. Diplomats exchanged data streams. Medics rotated shifts. Officers prepared testimony logs for the upcoming hearings. For the first time since the incursion began, the void felt calm, structured, predictable, almost safe. Then a tremor passed through the deep space channels. Not an alarm, not a threat declaration, a deviation. A ripple in the lattice of the 18 deep space listening buoys, so faint it barely registered as motion. Terran analysts froze mid-sentence as the readings unfolded across their screens. Gravitational drift without heat, vector displacement without emission, a silhouette without mass. Something had crossed the border seam, something none of their systems had predicted or even noticed until it was already inside. A stinger dropped like a breath pulled too sharply. No signature detected. Ambassador Rhea Salin leaned over the primary console, her voice measured but no longer serene. Trace the origin. But there was nothing to trace. No warp wake, no ion trail, no thermal bloom. The object had entered Terran jurisdiction as if it had always been there. Present, unseen, silent. In the anomaly wing, analysts overlay star maps from the erased systems. A faint pattern emerged, matching the same distortion threads found at Calyx 4, Meridian Reach, and Loom Sector. The intruder's path curved with eerie precision, neither random nor exploratory. It moved with intent, slipping through the grid as if the 4,000 satellites were blind to its existence. Terran interceptors repositioned instantly, forming a containment ring.
But their sensors saw nothing. Their scans passed through empty space, returning only noise filtered through algorithms that had never needed to imagine what could bypass them. The intruder glided beneath every threshold of detection, revealing itself only by the faint gravitational breath it displaced. Another quiet stinger carved itself into the moment. It should be impossible. On the Dominion flagship, Korvac watched Terran officers mobilize with attention he had not seen in the entire conflict. Their calm remained, but it had sharpened, no longer disciplined for war, but focused for survival. He realized with a slow and dawning clarity that the Terrans were not the danger the galaxy should fear. They were the only ones who had prepared for what now drifted among them. The object altered course, passing within a few thousand kilometers of a Terran vessel. No alarms triggered, no shields reacted. The ship's hull sensors recorded only a whisper of distortion, like fabric shifting in a dark room. Analysts enhanced the reading. A rough outline emerged, elongated, cold, devoid of engines or architecture familiar to any known species. It moved with purpose, yet revealed nothing. Terran Command issued a sector-wide silent alert. No public broadcast, no panic, only a transition from political procedure to existential readiness. The trials would continue, but under a new shadow, one older, broader, and utterly indifferent to borders or empires. Rhea Solid watched the faint distortion drift farther into Terran space, unstoppable as a tide. Her final words carried across the command deck with disciplined resolve. "Prepare the lattice. We face what erased the frontier." The intruder left no trail, no glow, no signature, only the certainty that humanity's true battle had just begun.